This week, we'll be exploring mysteries that range from these vast underground tunnels dug in the 1800s by this eccentric businessman, for why, nobody really knows, and we still have yet to fully explore and map them out, to one of the deadliest attacks and fires in San Francisco history, to some, quite frankly, mind-blowing science and space mysteries. We will explore all of this and more, so grab a drink. My choice today is tea with honey, and join me as we explore the Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg. And just a quick message, guys, I have a goal of 30,000 subscribers by the end of July, so if you're a long time watcher or if you're a new watcher, if you enjoy the videos, what have you, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button to help me reach that goal. But for now, let's get into the video. The Preparedness Day Bombing. So to cover this entry, we need to quickly explain something called the Preparedness Movement. And this was a movement around the time of World War I in America, where people who were in this movement, people who are pro-movement, preparedness movement, they said that we should be more prepared, essentially, for any attacks, for a entry into World War I. They said we should have stuff like the national draft, which wasn't a thing back then. We should invest more money and more time and more resources into the military, so that if we are forced to go into the war, or we are attacked or something like that, then we would be able to, defend ourselves and to defend other countries. And even the people in this movement who were advocating for stuff like peace, some of them also thought we should have a stronger military, because they said the best way to, fight for peace was to literally fight for peace. Like, if you're so weak, then you can't really do anything and you're forced into the war. So it had supporters from kind of all sorts of areas, but it also had people against this movement also from all sorts of areas and for all sorts of reasons. You had people who just didn't want to join the war because they saw it as like warmongering across the entire world. You had people who didn't care about putting money into the military. They said we should rather focus the economy and the resources and the money in our own country, or in America. I'm speaking from their perspective. So you had people against it for a economic reason. You had people against it for an anti-warmongering reason. And one of the reasons this came about was, at the time, America had like roughly 100,000 soldiers, sort of thing. Maybe 200,000 if you include like the National Guard and a few other, groups. So let's say 100 to 200,000. And Germany at the time had roughly 20 to 40 times as many soldiers. And all this was partly due to the fact that the US had no draft and Germany had like a mandatory draft for like all male citizens. So that is to be expected, but the difference in army sizes, or in soldier amounts, soldier sizes, was really quite drastic. So if they ever did go to war, then the US would obviously need more soldiers. And the people who were against this for war reasons were typically, the normal kind of anti-war reasons, saying that this movement was pushed by rich people, by powerful people who really had no skin in the game, and their sons and daughters wouldn't even fight in the war anyway. It was just a money-grabbing scheme to send poor people off in a war to die. And you also had people against the movement accuse people in the movement of like loving England. Like, they said, you love England so much that you're willing to cross the entire Atlantic Ocean and, fight in a war for the defense of England, essentially. Saying that we left England partly, at least, to get away from Europe and to get away from European politics. So we should just stay out of all of that. So yeah, as you can tell, there were a lot of aspects to this argument, both for and against it, and that is where this bombing comes into play. So this was in 1916 in San Francisco, where there was a parade arranged for this preparedness movement. So, typical parade, going through the streets, advertising their cause, sort of thing. And the general talking points, the general objectives were to start some sort of a draft, increase the size and the funding of the US government, and to enter World War I and put a stop to the fighting in Europe. And it was during this parade, basically just after it started, that a suitcase bomb was left at the parade, and then it went off and killed outright 10 people and badly wounded a further 40. Now, interestingly enough, a few weeks before this parade, there were these pamphlets kind of circulating around the city. These anonymous pamphlets, nobody knows who made them, but they were against the preparedness movement. They were anti-war, and the pamphlet said, we are going to use a little direct action on the 22nd, which was the date of the parade, to show that militarism can't be forced on us and our children without a violent protest. And then this pipe bomb, this suitcase bomb, went off about 30 minutes into the parade at around 2 p.m. Now, Thomas Mooney and Warren Billings, who were both Labour political leaders, they were on the left, and this cause was typically kind of a left versus right cause, although that wasn't the only divide. But the left generally was like anti-war, the right, the Conservatives, were more pro-war, and so these two Labour leaders were quite well known for being anti-preparedness movement. And they both were actually arrested soon after this and sentenced to death for their connection to this bombing. And then, later on, they had their sentence reduced to life. And then, eventually, after spending 23 years in prison, they both had their convictions overturned, they were both pardoned, and they were released from prison due to a complete, almost lack of evidence for this conviction. Like, the men had never confessed to this. The only real evidence against them was, like, circumstantial. You know, they were anti this movement. They had between them some experience with stuff like explosives, with bombs, with finicky devices like fixing watches sort of thing. And this was basically the evidence that was used to convict them. There was no DNA evidence, fingerprints, nobody came forward and confessed to being part of this. And so, as I said, the courts eventually decided that, look, this was a unjust conviction. And although there was some circumstantial evidence, it was absolutely not like a close and shut case, or an open and shut case. Closed and shut are the same thing. What am I even saying? But it wasn't an open and shut case. It wasn't that obvious. And the courts then decided it wasn't even enough to put forward a conviction. So they were released. No further evidence was really ever gathered on this case. No one figured out who produced these pamphlets or who, in the end, committed this attack. Quantum entanglement is insane, very sciencey, very spacey, absolutely mind-blowing, and I just love it. So it's quite a complex topic, and as always, I will try and explain it the best I can, try and simplify it down so it doesn't hurt yours and my head too much. And it has to do with two particles in space being like intrinsically linked no matter how far away they're brought. And the analogy or example that's often used to explain this, which I quite like, is the analogy of two coins. So normally, if we have two coins here, you know, they are not entangled, they're not connected in any way. So when you flip one coin, it doesn't change the position of the other coin, and it also doesn't tell you anything about the coin. If you flip heads on this one, for example, and you flip the other one but you don't look at it, it doesn't really matter which you flip, where you flip it. You can have two heads, two tails, heads, tails, whatever. But this is where quantum entanglement comes in, because hypothetically, if you were to entangle these two coins, which you can only really do with particles, but just as an example, if you entangled these two coins and then you brought them apart, whether you're in separate rooms or in separate countries or on separate planets or on the far side of the universe, it doesn't really seem to have a distance limit. But say we brought it to the other side of the universe, and then you flipped this coin, you looked at it, it happened to be heads, you would know with 100% certainty that the other coin is on tails. So the way this is done with particles is when these particles are entangled, you have, for example, the spin of one going one direction and the spin of the other going in the opposite direction. And these can change spins from time to time, so it's not like built into the particle. But when they measure the two, there seems to be some sort of connection where when one is spinning in one direction, the other is always spinning in the other direction. And consequently, when the other changes direction, the other also changes direction like instantaneously. And if you think that's weird and unusual and incredible, when you really think about it, it gets even stranger. Because, as some of you may have heard, some of you may have learnt, the fastest speed in the entire universe is the speed of light, which that's been proven physically in tests, that's been proven theoretically with like Einstein's work, and so everything seemingly in the universe has that cap of the speed of light. So light in a vacuum travels at the speed of light, gravity waves in a vacuum also travel at the speed of light, which is another interesting thing because light takes roughly 8 minutes to travel from the sun to Earth, and also so does gravity. So if, for example, you were to, Thanos snap the sun out of existence, we would still continue orbiting around the sun for a further 8 minutes until this lack of gravity waves caught up to us. That's the time it would take the gravity waves to reach us. And then after 8 minutes, we would fly off into the universe. But it is cool to think about gravity that way. But anyway, as I said, that's the fastest speed in the universe, except whatever's going on between these quantum entangled particles is happening basically instantaneously. In all the tests they've done, no matter how far they pull them apart, there doesn't seem to be any travel time for the connection, in that it's not as if you flip one coin, it lands on heads, and then that information travels to the other coin, and then that becomes tails, or that affects the other coin. It seems to be just instantly, whenever this coin is one way or the other coin is also the opposite way. And that is something that Einstein described as spooky action at a distance, and it is one of the wildest things I've ever read about. Like, we don't know how they're connected or how they know to, go in sync with the other particle. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. We don't know how the information gets from one to another, or at least how it gets there so fast, or if it's not getting anywhere, like there's no information traveling, but they're just somehow intrinsically linked. Somehow, as I said, we don't really know. There are a lot of mind-blowing, fascinating things in the quantum world, and this, for me, is one of the most interesting. It's kind of easy to explain compared to some of them, and it is just super fun, a little terrifying, very fascinating, and yeah, as I said, I just love it. Now, there was a point brought up on one of the videos I watched where they said that we couldn't necessarily use this for communication. Like, you think if there's a star 10,000 light years away, if we send information, we try and communicate with them, message them in the fastest way possible at the speed of light, it would still take 10,000 years to, get that message to them. So perhaps something like this, which seems to be instantaneous travel, could be used for messaging purposes. But as they pointed out, we can't really send messages with them because we can't choose what side the coin is on, or the particle. Like, we can't choose to have it on tails and then that'll change the other one to heads. It's just really an observation thing. So we can observe that the coin is on heads or tails, but we can't actually choose when it's going to be on either one of those or have any control over that. So yeah, can't seem to use that for communication, at least at the moment, but it is still very fascinating. The Robin Hood hackers refers to this group of hackers called the Dark Side hackers, who hacked and extorted multiple large multi-billion-dollar companies. And they took their money that they extorted from them. Then they said they want to make the world a better place. And so they donated tens of thousands of dollars worth of Bitcoin to multiple charities, which is insane, but also very cool. Like, yeah, I don't condone hacking, I don't condone stealing, but if you are gonna do it, at least do it from huge companies that can kind of handle that sort of thing, and also give it to charity. Some of these charities said, we're not going to accept this donation if it is proven to have been hacked. Others have said they're valid donations and, we're going to put the money to good use, we're going to save people and children, that sort of thing. And others have just refused to comment on it and have assumedly taken the money, which again, they're using it for good. I'm not necessarily putting them down for that, but it is a strange case. As I said, I don't condone stealing or hacking, but I'm almost 100% sure these thousands of dollars will benefit homeless people, people without water, that sort of thing, more than any of these multi-billion-dollar companies. But regardless, the identity or the identities of these Robin Hood hackers has never been released, has never been revealed, and still to this day, it remains a mystery. Rosa Day's Assailant. So for this mystery, we need to go all the way back to 1899, the very end of the 19th century, in Chester, North England. Rosa Day was a fairly normal, fairly down-to-earth, sensible young lady, and she was at home one day just before noon, and this was in the middle of winter, so she decided to go out skating. Her brother was out skating, there were a few of her friends out skating, and they typically found ponds, lakes, that sort of thing, and then skated on top of it as long as the ice was, solid enough. But she left to go skating. I guess her brother assumed that she would go to the same lake as him, or the same pond, or wherever they were at. But the time passed, and passed, and passed, and eventually Rosa wasn't at home. She wasn't at the lake that her brother or any of her friends were at. And so when the evening came around, when the rest of her family came home and they realized that Rosa is kind of nowhere, but that her hat and gloves and her skates and all that were missing from the home, they honestly started to get a little bit worried. I guess one of their first thoughts was that maybe she went out skating somewhere, fell through the ice, had an accident or an injury or something. So her family told the authorities about this. They started a local search. And they checked nearby ponds and lakes, they checked friends and family's houses, they asked people if they'd seen her, they checked shops, local hangout places, and Rosa was like just nowhere to be seen. Then they started searching forests, fields, they drained some canals and lakes, and still nothing turned up, and everyone was honestly starting to give up hope a little bit when, all of a sudden, out of the blue, Rosa turned up. She was found by a maid lying on the ground, like semi-conscious, completely fatigued. And this was quite lucky because it was the middle of winter, it was freezing, and if no one had found Rosa, she might have spent the night outside lying in the street, and she likely would have just frozen to death. So they brought Rosa in, they took care of her, and then she told them the story of what happened. Rosa said that day she had gone out to a local pond to go skating. She didn't go to the one that her brother was at, which explains why nobody saw her. And when she was on the ice, skating for a little bit, she felt that it was maybe a little thin, so that she shouldn't be skating on it. She came off the pond, she sat by the side, taking off her skates, and then she was ambushed by a man from behind. He said, or at least insinuated, that he had a gun. He blindfolded her, tied her hands behind her back, told her to give him all of her money, which she didn't have her purse on her, she didn't bring it out to the pond, so I guess this seemed to anger him. He got quite aggressive, and he also said that if she screamed or fought back or tried to get attention or anything, that he would just shoot her. So she kind of went along with it. He told her to, keep on walking, and he led her through these fields. She didn't really know where she was going because she was blindfolded, and he ended up taking her to basically this shed, and she said she lay there kind of in and out of consciousness. She was beaten and bruised quite a bit. She had very little to no food, water, and eventually, after a while, she suspected she was alone. She stood up. She was able to find this hole in the roof. She kind of wormed her way through it. She made it bigger. She broke out onto the roof, then dropped down the side into the field, and then she just kind of staggered around trying to find her way. She eventually found a river that she recognized, and then she followed this river back down to, where she was more familiar. Then she followed the route back home, and all the while she was, staggering through this journey. She was collapsing, going in and out of consciousness, and then eventually she was found by the maid nearby her home. So a brutal, horrific encounter. Some people at the time thought that Rosa may have made this whole thing up. They said that there was very little evidence for what she said happened at the lake. They said they couldn't really find evidence of a struggle there, which honestly, it doesn't even sound like there was much of a struggle even by her account. Like the way she told it, she was by the side of the pond. A guy came up behind her, said that if she struggled or fought back or made a sound or anything like that, he would shoot her. And she didn't really tell it as if she was struggling the whole way, so the lack of signs of a struggle doesn't really seem to me to be like evidence that she made it up. And they said that they could never really locate the shed that Rosa said she escaped from. Like they searched a bunch of nearby sheds in the area, none of them really matched this description, which, I mean, that's fine, but like what is the alternative? Like Rosa faked this attack, she faked her own disappearance, and then she beat herself, she stopped eating and drinking, and then after a few days staggered back to the home for why? There doesn't really seem to be much benefit for Rosa doing this outside of maybe attention, but to me honestly that seems like a bit of a stretch. But assuming Rosa was telling the truth, her assailant, her attacker, the man who came up behind her, was never identified, never found, never caught, and to this day remains a mystery. Stephen Paddock's house intruder. So this is quite a simple one, but Stephen Paddock was a man in Las Vegas who was responsible for committing the largest, most deadly mass shooting by a single man in the United States, at least up until a few years ago. He opened fire during a large music festival on the Las Vegas Strip, where at the time there was 22,000 participants in this festival, so it was very crowded, very packed. During his shooting, he killed 60 people and injured almost 900 more. Then he scurried back to his hotel room like the little rat that he was, and he took care of himself, which honestly he should have done that before killing all of these people, but whatever. But this entry is in reference to after the shooting, after Stephen's death, while Stephen's house was, kind of made a crime scene. It was being searched, investigated. One night, when all of the people searching the home went home, the house was still cordoned off. It was still, a secure area. But one of these nights, a neighbor called the police and said that there was a light turned on inside of the home. Like, they suspected someone had broken in, turned on a light, was searching for something, and they didn't know what they were doing in there, so the neighbor eventually called the police. And the cops eventually went round. They saw that some of the lights were turned on, and they found some evidence for someone having been in there. But when the police arrived there, there was no one there. So who broke in there, why, what they were searching for is still a complete mystery. Whether this was maybe families of some of the victims, going around there for some sort of vigilante justice to try and find evidence against Stephen or something like that. That's a slight possibility. Whether this was a family member or friend or accomplice or something of Stephen going in there to try and get evidence, to try and, erase evidence, that's also a possibility. But yeah, as I said, we don't know either way. Nobody ever came forward for doing this or was ever, figured out or convicted or charged for trespassing, I guess this would be. So that is currently part of the mystery. Stephen Koecher, or Koecher, or Koecher. If you know how to pronounce this, please let me know in the comments, as I've seen many different versions on these pronounce websites, and I don't know if any of them are actually correct. But anyway, Stephen is a man who went missing in 2009 in Nevada, and he was seen on camera parking his car up on the side of the road in a cul-de-sac, and he then gets out of his car, he leaves the car, he returns after a short while, grabs something seemingly out of the car, and then walks away again, and after this point is never seen. Eventually, his abandoned car was reported, his work and his family and all that were notified, and then they notified the police and filed a missing persons report, and obviously a search was started. Now, there are a few interesting things in this case and around Stephen's kind of activities, at least in the months preceding this disappearance. Firstly, it wasn't thought that Stephen was involved in any nefarious activities, anything to do with wacky-tobacco, any money laundering sort of thing. It wasn't thought this was the case, but I guess it is always at least a slim possibility. But in the week leading up to his disappearance, he was driving quite a bit. He was driving between Utah and Nevada, sometimes covering as much as 1,000 miles in one day. And there weren't too many theories about this case, not too much evidence showed up. As I said, Stephen was never found, there was no footage of him found, so some of these theories are a little bit tenuous, but one of them involved a man named Joshua Powell, who was a man at the time suspected of killing his wife, Susan Powell, and this theory says that Stephen and Susan were having an affair, hence kind of all the driving. Stephen was visiting Susan, maybe going to hotels or something like that. And Joshua eventually found out he killed his wife, which obviously he was a suspect for, but that he also killed Stephen, which if the connection between Stephen and Susan was either not discovered or was really, deep below the surface, really hidden sort of thing, then maybe police wouldn't have even made that connection and wouldn't have seen Joshua as a suspect. That's one theory. Another theory was related to Stephen's seeming money problems. So his mother thought that Stephen was traveling around quite a bit, going out to Nevada in order to secure a job, to look for work. As he did seem to have some money problems, he was struggling to pay his mortgage, that sort of thing. And so that's where the theories of, Stephen doing stuff for money, maybe some illegal activities, maybe some money laundering, and perhaps he got in with the wrong people, and that ultimately ended up getting him killed. But as I said, there's no real evidence for that outside of speculation. And his phone, interestingly enough, was actually kept on for quite a while, and it wasn't much use in the search because when Stephen parked his car up, the last we saw of him, it wasn't like he was needed anywhere or expected anywhere or even missing at that point. So when they traced all of the pings of the phone, they found that the phone pinged a few miles north of where the car was parked up, and then a few hours later it pinged a few more miles north, and then it pinged even more north, and then stayed around that area for a few days, and then just shut off completely. And it's assumed that the phone probably ran out of battery at this point. And it was a day after this last ping that his car was discovered. The local people, reported it in. Then his family was notified, then the authorities, and then the search started. But all of this was after Stephen's last ping. Nothing much came of the search, especially in regards to the pings. And that was kind of it. They never found out why Stephen was in that local area, if he was meeting anyone, and if he was, then who he was meeting, where he had gone, especially with these phone pings, and ultimately, what happened to Stephen. We don't know to this day whether he is dead, whether he is alive and went missing, or disappeared, or perhaps, changed his name and had a new identity and left the country or anything like that. And to this day, the case still remains quite a puzzling mystery. The Suriname capital homeless slayings. So these were these tragic killings that took place in Suriname, this place, over several years. Between 2006 and 2007, 5 homeless people were brutally murdered and nobody knows why. Some were burnt, some were decapitated, some were beaten and tortured, shot, attacked with an axe. But that was just over these 2 years, and police estimate that over the years, between 12 and 15 homeless people were killed in quite similar brutal ways. All of them homeless, all of them dead, all of them unsolved. It is a very brutal case or collection of cases, and much like adult workers, homeless people, tend to be vulnerable, they tend to be needy, they're sleeping out in the open, they're often exposed, and they probably have a hard time defending themselves. So again, with these attacks, it seems like someone's just taking advantage of that opportunity, attacking the lowest, most down and out people in society that often can't fight back. And because these people were all homeless, most of them didn't have IDs or nobody knew who they were. So authorities weren't able to contact their family to often get a proper send-off, and they end up often not being solved, as these cases weren't. Tabitha Tuders was a 13-year-old girl who went missing in 2003 in Tennessee. She was heading to school one morning. She was heading from her home to the local bus stop, and she was seen by at least one witness getting into a red car, and then she was never seen again. It is a tragic case that is still unsolved. Nobody knows who picked her up, who the red car belonged to, and there wasn't much evidence for this case. There weren't many or any leads or witnesses, like 1 or 2 witnesses sort of thing, but very few. And this case was suspected of being connected to another case, which was the disappearance and eventual death of a 11-year-old girl, Heaven Ross. And she also disappeared on her way to school from home one morning, but sadly her remains were later found, so we know that she was killed, but the remains of Tabitha were never found. Whether that means she's still alive somehow, somewhere to this day, or just that her remains were never found, we don't know. As I said, the car was never identified. The driver or abductor or abductors or whatever were never identified. And it's just a really tragic case, and I hate cases like this. The Tecaxic-Calixtlahuaca head is firstly a very hard entry to say, and secondly is this terracotta head of this belonging to, I guess, this artifact, this sculpture that was found in the Toluca Valley near Mexico City in 1933. Now, the style of this figurine, this head, resembles, as some have pointed out, quite a Roman style, and so they highly suspect that this figurine, artifact, sculpture is of Roman origin. And this is awfully strange because it hints at some connection, perhaps, maybe some trade between the Romans and the New World or South America before Columbus ever went there. Some people think, however, this is not what happened, and that yes, while the tests do show that this figurine is most likely from Rome and from around the 2nd to 3rd century AD, this doesn't prove that the head actually got to South America in the 3rd century. They think it was produced in the 3rd century, it was, sculpted or crafted, and then maybe sometime around Columbus's time, maybe sometime after that, someone bought it from somewhere in Europe, wherever it was from. They had it on their ship, they went over to America, and then it ended up, getting lost, getting buried, and it was discovered in 1933. Or it could have come here before Columbus arrived here, but not necessarily on a boat. They said that perhaps there was a ship floating around the sea in the 4th, 5th, 6th century, and then it shipwrecked, and the shipwreck floated all the way to the Americas, and as well as probably many other things, this head was taken by the local people and then ended up by them getting lost and buried, and that is how it got to America. Or one of the last options, one of the last theories, is that this was kind of a hoax. The head was secured somewhere else by someone else, and during around this time of the excavation, they took the head, maybe snuck it along in their pocket, and then when they were digging out this old American archaeology, they slipped the head under the ground, dusted it off, and was like, whoa, crazy Roman stuff. I mean, that is one of the other theories. So yeah, a few theories for this one. Not super amounts of evidence for any one theory in particular, but the whole mystery of this one is how exactly it got to America, who brought it here, and where it, came from. The Terra Nova Islands are something we covered way higher up in the iceberg, or maybe it was in another iceberg. I'll probably leave the graphic to whatever iceberg it was next to my face, but it's probably best you just watch every video I've ever made, just so you can be sure you didn't miss it. But these are what are known as Phantom Islands. And Phantom Islands are islands that seem to exist, at least historically. They are on old maps, they are on diagrams, there's often like witness testimony of sailors that have gone to these islands or seen them in the distance. And obviously it's because of this witness testimony often that these maps were made. Except when we go to the island, or to where the island should be, we basically find nothing. So they are what are deemed as Phantom Islands. One of the more well-known examples of this is an island called High Brazil, which is not to be confused with actual Brazil in South America, but this was an island thought to exist and was mapped out and was talked about and all of that, and this was to the west of Ireland. So you have England, you have Ireland, and then further west you had this tiny island called High Brazil, which obviously, when we go out there now, when we look out there, when we do scans, High Brazil doesn't exist and seemingly never existed. It's all really very strange. But the Terra Nova Island were these two islands thought to exist, and they were mapped off the coast of Antarctica. And they remained on maps all the way up to like the 1980s. And this is when in 1989, there was an expedition planned to go out there to map some things to, explore a little bit. And when the ship got there, when they looked around, these islands were just nowhere to be seen, which is giving me kind of Lost vibes, if I'm honest. And I know a lot of you have either never seen Lost or just absolutely hate it, but I seem to think it is maybe one of the best shows of all time. But when they couldn't find these islands, they started to do like echo sound locations underneath the water to try and see maybe if the islands sank a little bit or the water rose and so the water was covering them. But they found that the water where the islands should have been was actually quite deep, and so it didn't indicate any hidden island or sunken island or anything like that. And so we just don't know what happened to the islands, if they in fact ever existed, if they existed in another place perhaps, and we just got the location wrong. So yeah, very strange mystery, and I do quite like these ones, a little more lighthearted, a little more spooky mystery sort of thing. But yeah, Phantom Islands. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. So these were these horrific 3 murders of 3 Girl Scouts in 1977 Oklahoma. These were 8-year-old Lori Farmer, 9-year-old Michelle Goose, and 10-year-old Doris Milner. They were, at the time, out camping, as, you tend to do in the Scouts, spend a lot of time in nature sort of thing. And the girls' tent was notably the farthest away tent from the tent of the supervisor, and the vision, the eyeline of the tent, was at least partially obscured by the camp showers. So it was probably one of the worst tents to be in if there was someone out there, ready to attack, willing to attack, which obviously that doesn't happen too often, so the camp supervisors, the camp organizers didn't really think anything of it. And everything went as normal. The nighttime came, the 3 girls went to their tent, they went to sleep, sleep in their tent. And then, come the following morning, one of the supervisors was making their way to the camp showers, and they noticed the body of one of the girls inside of a sleeping bag near the path of the camp showers. The supervisor immediately ran to the girl, checked on her, but soon realized that the girl was actually dead. And so in a panic, they ran to the tent. They got all of the girls out of all the other tents, but the other two girls were nowhere to be found. They quickly checked the nearby path, the woods, the forest, the bushes, but soon realized that the other two girls were actually at the bottom of the sleeping bag. So all three girls were in the sleeping bag, but only one was sticking out. And I find these cases very hard to cover. They're very brutal, very horrible. And even worse than this, all three of the girls had been physically beaten, and they had all been assaulted and then eventually killed. There were no immediate suspects at the time, and as I said, the camp officials, the camp supervisors didn't really expect an attack like this, because I mean, why would they? It was so out of the ordinary, so unusual. Except less than 2 months before these murders took place, there was a supervisor on camp who realized that when she went back to her tent one day, that someone had been rummaging around her tent, around her belongings, and had actually taken and eaten all of the donuts that she had. But more importantly, they left a note for the supervisor saying that we are on a mission to kill 3 girls in tent 1. And the camp director was notified of this, but eventually just discarded it as a hoax, as a prank. And then obviously this happened less than 2 months later, which, what the hell? Like, how are authorities not notified of something like this? Or at least some insane security put in place to, possibly guard against this? It seems like just massive negligence. Now, shortly after these murders, during the investigation as it progressed, there was a man named Gene Leroy Hart, who was a Native American who was eventually arrested for these crimes. He was actually already serving a life sentence, in fact a multiple life sentence, for assault, shall we say, and kidnapping, but he had actually escaped from prison, and so he was out and about when the murders of these girls took place. Police eventually, roughly a year after he escaped, did arrest him and recapture him, and he was charged for these 3 murders. There was DNA evidence found at the scene of the crime, and the DNA evidence narrowed it down to like 1 in 7,000. So in the entire country, there was an estimated 7,700 Native Americans who shared this similarity in DNA with Leroy. So basically, he was one out of almost 8,000 Native Americans that could have committed this crime, which is sort of a match. It's pretty good, but it's not fully conclusive. And so partly at least because of that, and partly because of a lack of general evidence as well, Leroy was found not guilty during his trial and was not charged with these 3 murders. However, he was sent straight back to prison to serve the remaining 305 years of his 308-year sentence. So he will likely be in prison for the rest of his life, but he wasn't charged with the killings of these girls. The sheriff said at the time that he was like 1,000% sure that this was the work of Leroy, but obviously the jury didn't agree with him, and so whoever killed and attacked and brutally assaulted these innocent girls is to this day technically, officially, still a mystery. The thing in Devil's Hole. So this entry could honestly just be Devil's Hole, and it would still be incredibly interesting. The Devil's Hole is this chasm, this underwater lake sort of thing, that is actually underneath the Death Valley, around the California-Nevada border. But yeah, this is this vast underground lake, this underground pool that you can actually enter into through this relatively small opening, and the water down there is quite warm. It sits at around a pretty consistent temperature of 33 Celsius, and it is quite a salty body of water. But that's just on the surface, and the lake itself goes down and down and down through these tunnels and underground rooms and caverns sort of thing. And as you can see from this general map, it goes kind of down through a narrow opening and then opens out into this big body of water, and then eventually it slowly goes down almost into like a funnel sort of thing, and then comes out into an even bigger body of water. And what is below that body of water, we kind of have no idea. We've only mapped it out to roughly like 400 or 500 feet deep, so it's still kind of a mystery as to what's actually down there. Now, the title of this entry, The Thing in Devil's Hole, could potentially refer to a few different things. One is that there was a potential sighting of a cryptid, a lizard creature, a monster sort of thing in and around the area of this chasm. And this goes back like 100 years, more than 100 years. It's obviously never been captured. It's never been caught on film. It's this mythical, cryptidy, rumory sort of thing. That is one thing that it could refer to. Another thing that it could refer to is something that Charles Manson actually believed. And he thought that below the water, there was either a ancient civilization, and there are a few options for this. Either the entire area is completely submerged, and so this race of beings is like reptilian, or they can breathe underwater somehow and they live down there, or somehow you go down through the water and then you come up into a underground cavern that is filled with air, and so there's an ancient civilization living down there, or a potential ancient civilization used to live down there and then they either died out or moved out once it got flooded or something like that. And this also ties back into the monster that we were talking about, how the monster could have been a member of this ancient race, and perhaps it just came out of the water and was spotted coming up, and then after it was spotted, it, ran away, went back into the water, and went back home. Or it could refer to something called a pupfish, which is this little fish that is actually one of the rarest fish in the entire world. This fish only lives down here in the Devil's Chasm, or the Devil's Hole, and it is technically an endangered species, with the fish never numbering any more than like 500 at a time, and in fact going as low as only 75 fish just really a few years ago. Or, and I know there was a lot of ors on this case, but this one is perhaps the most extensive one on the list. But this is the case of 3 brothers in 1965 who actually went skin diving in the lake. They went at nighttime, they brought some of their family with them. Their family was sitting up on the surface level waiting for them. The 3 brothers geared up, went into the water, and eventually 2 of the brothers came up, and the 3rd was nowhere to be seen. So the 2 men went back down to look for their brother, and then only 1 of the men came up. And they eventually went to get help. There were multiple dives and searches and all of that done. And sadly, these 2 men who went missing were never found. They never resurfaced. Their bodies were never found. And the most they found in their dives, in their searches, was some of their gear, like some of their diving gear, a torch, but none of the bodies. It was thought that perhaps the young men who went missing took like a wrong turn. Like, as you can see here, there are a few like little tunnels. Perhaps they took one of these going upwards and got stuck somehow. Or maybe they ran out of air and purposefully took one of these tunnels, as there were a few areas with like these air pockets in. Or there are theories that they went a little bit loopy down here in the water, which sometimes can happen due to carbon dioxide poisoning, which I covered that one a little bit in the ocean iceberg. Or potentially some people say there are creatures living down there, and these men were just attacked by these creatures. Since these endangered fish live down here, it's very hard to get any sort of permit to go exploring or to fully map out the chasm, so we haven't really done that yet. Hopefully it gets done eventually sometime in the future, but yeah, sadly we never found these missing brothers. We have no idea, not really, what's actually down there, and that is a terrifying thought. The Tsavo Man-Eaters. So these were these 2 huge man-eating lions that killed several dozen people, potentially up to 100 people, in Kenya in the late 1800s. They would stalk them, they would hunt them down, sneak into camps, take the bodies, and some of this happened in like the dead of night. So you're sleeping in a tent maybe in the dead of night, and then a huge bloody lion attacks you, rips you out of your tent. Like, this was just a thing of nightmares. And this sounds similar to, you know, something like cryptids or even hoaxes. And some people at the time thought that it was just rumors or something to scare the people, and they didn't know whether it was real or not real. But unfortunately for them, this was absolutely, completely real. And they were eventually hunted down and killed by a military officer, Colonel John Henry Patterson, who was actually Irish, so win for us. And it took a ridiculous amount of attempts and shots to actually kill these lions. Like, the first lion was shot and then actually ended up escaping, and then it came back later that night and was actually found stalking and hunting John Patterson. So imagine getting shot by this military guy, running away, but then coming back and stalking the guy who shot you. Like, these lions were seriously ballsy, seriously badass, but they were killing humans, so that's not a great thing. The lion was unsuccessful in his stalking and actually ended with Patterson killing the lion instead. Then a few weeks after this, the second lion was located and found, and he died after being killed, after being shot 9 times with like various rifles. And it was said that even at the end, as the lion was lying there dying, it was still trying to claw its way to Patterson to try and kill him. So these were some insane lions, and we don't know to this day exactly why they were attacking humans, why they went kind of on this killing spree. It's probably due to a few different factors. One being perhaps their main source of food had died out somehow. You know, if they were mainly eating cattle, it's theorized that there was a local cattle plague, killed a bunch of them, so the lions started to go hungry. And sometimes there were dead humans of natural causes found at the Tsavo River crossing, just because of the, you know, natural danger of the area. So it's thought that perhaps some of the local lions found these bodies, got kind of a taste for humans, and then when their food source died out, they realized, hey, there's a bunch of humans here, let's just go sneak into their camp, hunt them down, sort of thing. And that is the most likely theory, at least, but we don't know 100% for certain. These lions were absolutely terrifying. They were huge, 10-foot long lions, and their carcasses, after they'd been killed, took 8 fully grown strong men to carry them back to camp. So yeah, it must have been a absolutely terrifying time to be around that area, around that time, and during this killing spree. The Tyumen Maniac was this Russian serial killer who killed at least 8 children in Tyumen, Russia, between 1997 and 2009. Now, these cases, as with a lot of these cases on this list this week for some reason, are a little hard to go through, quite honestly, but I'll just touch on the names quite briefly. A lot of them were attacked and were abused in some horrible ways, but for my own and your sanity, I won't go much further into the details on that. There was firstly 2-year-old Nikolai Ivanov, who went missing in 1997, but there's not too many more details on this particular one, and I'm just putting it out there that most of these names are Russian. I don't speak Russian, and I might get some of the name pronunciations wrong. But the same year, we have 17-year-old Lyubov Simonova, who went missing while out walking back home. The next was 13-year-old Irina Kashanova, then 12-year-old Aliona Imanova, 10-year-old Sonia Telesheva, 14-year-old Irina Bukrina, 8-year-old Eduard Alimbiev, 12-year-old Anastasia Loshkina, again 12-year-old Anna Anisimova, and potentially 11-year-old Daria Nekrasova, and 13-year-old Senia Bukova. Like, Jesus Christ. Some of these children were never found, some were found dead, some were assaulted, some weren't assaulted, some had been beaten, but they were all thought quite likely linked, at least, to one another. And for almost 25 years since the first disappearance, there was little to no evidence or leads or suspects until in 2021, the body of 8-year-old Nastia Muravyova was found by a lake, wrapped and hidden in plastic and boxes, and this would be the killer's undoing, because the boxes were eventually traced back to a furniture making company, and when police went to this company and requested a DNA sample of everyone who worked there. Pretty much everyone agreed to hand over their DNA, except for one worker by the name of Vitaly Bereshnoi. And this obviously drew suspicion from the police, and not long after this, his apartment was searched, and he actually admitted to killing Nastia. But he didn't know how it happened, he said. He said that one night he was drinking, he was just blackout drunk, he couldn't remember anything, and when he woke up, Nastia's dead body was just there in his bathtub. Which, it's like, why can't you just admit to it, just own up to it, take some responsibility for it, for Christ's sake? He said, you know, oh, I was as shocked as you are. I didn't know how it happened, I didn't know where she came from, and so in a panic I wrapped her body up and dumped her by this lake. He said he didn't kill any of the other children, but then again, how would he know if he's, you know, blackout drunk and he can't remember anything? But since there was no further evidence, he was arrested for the killing of Nastia, but he didn't confess to any of the other killings, and so they are all either just unsolved missing persons or unsolved murders. But fuck this guy. The upstairs lounge arson attack. So this was an attack, a fire that was started in the upstairs lounge bar in New Orleans in 1973. And due to this fire that was started, 32 people died, with a further 15 being seriously injured. Now, the upstairs lounge was a gay bar in New Orleans in the 70s, and since a lot, if not all of the patrons were gay, this has obviously led to theories about this being a homophobic sort of attack, which is quite a reasonable theory, I would think, except that the only real other major suspect that they had was a man named Roger Dale Nunez, who was actually in this bar, and he was kicked out earlier in the evening for having a fight with one of the other patrons, and he was said to suffer from various mental issues leading to stuff like jitteriness, anxiety, maybe paranoia. And so the timeline of events, the bar opened up, people were drinking, all of that sort of thing. There was a happy hour that evening. And then a little later on, one of the members of staff was perhaps stocking up, checking on the venue, and they realized that there was a fire started on the stairs. And by this point, the fire was blazing quite strongly. So in a hurry, they got a bunch of the patrons, at least some of them. They took them up the stairs to the roof and crossed over to the adjacent building. And these people made it out. But there was a fair few more of them stuck inside of the building. And one of the other major ways that people tried to escape from this was by smashing the windows and trying to go out that way, because it was only on the second floor. So it's not super likely the drop would have killed you. But one of the problems with this was that there were actually security bars put on the window to purposefully stop people falling against the window, smashing it, and falling out of it. And so now these bars were actually keeping them inside of the venue, trapped with the fire. There were some people who were able to squeeze through the bars. You know, some of the slimmer people, there were some people pushing, squeezing other people out through the bars, who then dropped down onto the street below. But yeah, a lot of them just succumbed to the fire, succumbed to the smoke. And as I said, when all was said and done, 32 people ended up dying. Now, apparently this Nunez guy told a friend on several occasions that he had started the fire, that he was kicked out of the bar, he was mad, he came back, he bought this like lighter fluid from Walgreens or Walmart, and he went back there, sprayed it on the stairs, lit a match and threw it at the fire or at the fuel, and this is how the fire started. And also by his friend's testimony, he said that Nunez said that he didn't think the fire would, you know, grow that large. He maybe wanted to scare people, maybe damage some of the building or something like that, but he said he didn't think it would kill that many people, which that's whether you believe Nunez is being honest, and that is even if you believe that his friend's testimony is, you know, genuine, as Nunez himself never admitted to any of this. The fire department was also late at arriving to the scene because of traffic and like no way to get through, which is an awful tragedy. And Nunez actually died a year after this via taking care of himself, and so since he was the only real major suspect, there was no further evidence found of any kind. No one was ever convicted for this, and the case was actually closed in 1980. So a very tragic one, and I hope they're all in a better place now. The Williamson Tunnels. So these are these tunnels, super cool, deep, hidden tunnels beneath a small area of Liverpool in England. They are thought to have been dug and created by a man named Joseph Williamson, and this was in the early 1800s, and Williamson was kind of a man of many talents. He was quite eccentric. He was quite a good businessman. He sold and bought tobacco. He sold and bought buildings and land and that sort of thing. So he was a smart guy. He had tons of money. He was a little, creative, eccentric is the word that they use. So maybe a little bit loopy, a little bit reactive in a way. But he was seemingly very kind at the same time. He often gave a bunch of money to charity. He donated for stuff like public buildings, for public parks, sort of thing. And using some of this money, he built these tunnels. And they were, over time, slowly forgotten about, slowly buried, and weren't really fully rediscovered or dug up until almost 200 years later, in 1995. Now, this whole topic, the whole purpose of these tunnels is really quite interesting. As I said, Williamson liked to do eccentric, random things, but he also liked to help people out, to donate to charity. And it was very highly suspected that that is what Williamson was doing with these tunnels, because a lot of the workforce that he had in building, in digging it out, was stuff like people who were homeless, or just poor and down and out, or stuff like army veterans, like basically people that were out of work that really needed money, and he would pay them a full wage, have them come down here, have them do whatever work he said. And he's sometimes quoted as kind of making the point that if he just gives people money, firstly, they don't really feel like they deserve the money, especially not in that era, and secondly, they're not improving, they're not gaining a sense of purpose or direction, and thirdly, he's kind of taking away their pride. At least if they earn their money, they can go back to their family, they can be seen as, a good, strong dad. He's out there working every day for us. Whereas if you're just given money, it's like, you're helpless sort of thing. So he wanted to keep that sense of pride within these people. He would sometimes get them to do regular work. He would sometimes get them to do seemingly meaningless work when there was no work around. So if there was like nothing to do on the site, instead of just sending them home or reducing the workforce so they didn't get money, he would make stuff up like, yeah, we need to move all of this rubble to the complete opposite side of the site, and then once the crew had spent like an entire day moving it all across, he would say like, I'm so silly, it actually needs to come back over this way. So they would then move all the rubble back to where it came from. He would also set them tasks that were seemingly like very difficult. So some of the intricate carvings and structures underneath the ground, like in the tunnel area, some of these were like in places that were so dimly lit and hard to see that it wouldn't make sense to build them so intricately. But I think he thought that by giving these people that experience, setting them difficult tasks, that they would basically learn from it, they would get better at their craft, and that would help them going forward, which a bunch of the workers actually attested to that. They said that the work that they did with Williamson in these tunnels, that experience actually helped them get further jobs later down the road. So he seems honestly like a very cool dude, a very generous dude, a very thoughtful dude. But as to the purpose of these tunnels, we don't know exactly why he built them. They may have just been a creative, spur-of-the-moment thing that he could also use as an excuse to pay these people, keep them in jobs sort of thing. Or potentially they could have been, secret emergency tunnels or bunkers. But yeah, we don't really know for sure, though it is a pretty cool entry. I mean, do you really expect me to say all of that? God damn it. 62.104015544649324.9864641443. So this was this strange video that was posted on YouTube in 2014, and as you can see, it's very odd, very strange filters, kind of a spooky kind of vibe, jump cuts, strange audio, strange figures, and we don't know who posted it or what it means. Now, when you enter the video's title, these numbers, which I am not going to say again, but when you enter them into Google, they represent coordinates that pinpoint this specific area in Finland. What that means? Nobody really knows. It could be in reference to a few spooky occurrences or events that happened kind of nearby, kind of a few kilometers from these coordinates. There was this seemingly spooky or haunted forest of sorts, and we don't know if the forest itself is a hoax or whether the video is real and the forest is real and the video is pointing to the forest, or if none of it is real and it's just made up, it's a hoax, and the video was just some quirky little scary internet video that someone made up. Very little to go off on this one, so I will leave it there for now. Never open it. RAR. So this one is quite an interesting one. This is a folder, a RAR folder, which means it's a compressed folder with some stuff inside of it. And apparently inside of it there is a file called eeriness.gif, not GIF, and I will fight you on that one, but it's this eeriness.gif file that is apparently one of the scariest images on the entire internet. And I can't show it to you because nobody knows what it actually is. The folder itself is password protected, and we simply don't know the password. There have been several attempts at cracking the password, at brute forcing it, although they say a pure brute force would take like 117,000 years, I think they estimated, because it is a very long and very difficult password. Apparently, some people say they have cracked it and say they found the file, but there are a few different people saying this and a few different versions of what the file is. So like they can't all be right, but they can all be wrong, or they can all be a hoax. As I said, people have said they've somehow cracked it, they found the file, and that the eeriness GIF is either like Rick Roll, or it's a GIF of Donald Duck, or a girl being injured, or a creepy face with a creepy smile, and we don't know if any of these are the file or whether none of them are. So yeah, it's a very strange one. It's reminiscent, I think, of like the early internet kind of spooky pasta, creepy pasta sort of days, and it's thought that it might be potentially that, a hoax, or that it could be a purposefully insanely difficult password to crack, and that whenever someone does actually crack this and shows proof of the file inside the folder, then this whole thing will be revealed as like a hacking recruitment or something. Like they will go to the person who hacked the folder and be like, that was a fantastic job, you did incredible in that hacking. I don't know what hackers talk about, but they'll basically recruit that person to, you know, do some ethical hacking. At least that is one of the theories. But as of right now, it is still a pretty strange, pretty scary, pretty unknown internet mystery. Zelim Bakaev was a man who went missing in 1992 from Grozny in Chechnya. Now, Zelim was a singer, he was a dancer, and he was quite popular and fairly well known around the time in areas like Russia, in Dagestan, and obviously in Chechnya. Now, a very important part about this case, a very important point, is that Zelim was apparently openly gay. And in recent years especially, the Chechnyan government has had sort of like a gay purge sort of thing, where they have explicitly forbade homosexuality. They have been known to kill people who are openly homosexual, or at least that like display it openly in public. And Zelim himself had previously been forbidden from making public appearances in Chechnya. But at the time he was in Russia, he ended up traveling back to his hometown in Chechnya to attend his sister's wedding. And then a few days after arriving, he ended up being arrested by Chechnyan special forces, and his phone was deactivated. The authorities told his mother, told his aunt that Zelim had been released by them, like, oh, that was ages ago, he's long gone by now. They said he wasn't part of any ongoing cases. They said they didn't have him, that they just questioned him, then released him, and they had no idea where he was. But after about a week of Zelim not turning up, not contacting anyone, his mum understandably filed a missing persons report, and the Chechnyan government, the Chechnyan officials, they refused to start this investigation because they said that, as I mentioned earlier, that they had released him, that it wasn't a mystery, he had probably gone back to Russia, and they weren't going to waste their time starting an investigation or looking for him. And many people think that this is obviously because they didn't want to investigate themselves, because after Zelim was captured, the theory says that he was tortured, he was interrogated, and he was eventually killed for being gay. His mother pleaded and contacted some American human rights organizations, and she made a public inquiry directly to the president of Chechnya, saying to let her son go, or at least if they killed him, to let them know that and give them back the body so they could bury him, they could, you know, mourn him. But these investigations didn't really go anywhere. The Chechnyan authorities in particular never started a investigation into, you know, a missing person, that being Zelim. And to this day, what happened to Zelim, where he went, if he was killed, who he was killed by, is technically a mystery. As I said, there's some evidence and some strong suspicions, towards certain, bad players. But officially to this day, he is still considered missing, and his case is still unsolved. The Lanaye Girl was a woman who was found dead in Belgium in 2009. She was found by a guy just walking along his local canal, which was nearby the Dutch-Belgium border, and this led some people to believe that perhaps she was Dutch, perhaps she was Belgian, like she could feasibly have been from either side of the border sort of thing. And she was found, as I said, dead, fully naked in this canal, tied up with rope, having her throat been slit, and her body was just covered in multiple stab wounds, which, the cases this week are absolutely brutal and horrific. There isn't too much to go on for this one. The body was weighted down by these dumbbell weights in the water, which apparently didn't work for too long, and it was thought that she was in the water for anywhere between 1 and 5 weeks, just due to the state that the body was in. But that's about all they gathered. She had quite unique nails, like nail designs at the time of death, but this didn't seem to really lead anywhere. It was one of the only minor unique things about the case though. And there were a few men seen kind of nearby, driving a truck somewhere in and around that, 1 to 5 week time frame, but it was quite a vague sighting. The men were never identified, the van was never identified, and so nothing really came of that. And so to this day, we don't know who this woman was, where she came from, why she was killed, who she was killed by, and why she was attacked in such a brutal manner. I hope this case does get solved soon enough, at least sometime in the future, and that this girl, whoever she was, wherever she was from, can get some sort of justice. And that is all we have time for. Kind of a mixed bag this week was. Some very fun, interesting space mysteries, science mysteries, some quirky ones, some internet mysteries, but also a lot of quite brutal attacks and killings. But this week also marks the end of the 7th tier of this iceberg. There are still a fair few more tiers to go in this iceberg, so we are not done yet, not by a long shot. But we have covered an absolute ton of mysteries in these 7 tiers. The ones we have yet to cover in these further tiers get even crazier, even more fascinating, even more unknown, and I absolutely can't wait to cover them, and I hope you will join me in exploring them. But I hope you're enjoying your day or night wherever you may be, if we never meet again this side of heaven, and as always, thanks for watching.